that, okay, because I've got that on the side of what I'm seeing. All right, so yeah, this is a paper by Jacob Cohen, a fairly famous figure in statistics, a psychologist who did a lot of work on sample size planning, and wrote this paper in 1994 criticizing null hypothesis statistical testing, as he called it. NHST, apparently intended to be pronounced nasty. And so the paper has, I think, 3 parts, at least that's what I'll go over. It's a lot of history about the criticisms of null hypothesis testing, what the problems are, some review from his point of view, and his recommendations. So he cites Bergson from back as far as 1938, so criticisms, of course, go back a long way. He notes that he was himself appalled by a 1957 book-length critique. At that time, he was a very enthusiastic practitioner of null hypothesis testing. And that's one of the things that makes this paper interesting, is that it's really a profound change of heart, which doesn't happen very often in science. I think the saying is that ideas die out when their proponents themselves die, because no one ever changes their mind. Even back in 1960, there was a publication that talked about null hypothesis testing and said the statistical folkways of a dominant. So that's a characterization from a long time ago, and it's already talking about this as primitive. And an analogy with the story of the emperor has no clothes, back as far as 1966. So there's a lot of good history of criticism of the practice. So he notes a number of problems, starting with the problem that the logic degrades when it's made probabilistic. And he gives this example: if a man is an American, then he is probably not a member of Congress. This man is a member of Congress, therefore he is probably not an American. And Cohen argues that this is sort of how p-values work, null hypothesis testing works. Another important problem is that misinterpretation of p-values is very common. And he cites a number of them, giving most emphasis to the problem that people tend to believe that the p-value tells you the probability that the null hypothesis is true, given the data that you've observed. And of course, it can differ greatly from that probability because it's really the reverse. It's the probability of the data given that the null hypothesis is true. He also cites the misinterpretation that 1 minus the p-value is the probability of a repeat experiment also having p less than 0.05 or being statistically significant. And he notes that finding statistical significance does not confirm the alternative theory. There are always a number of other things that could have gone wrong, and of course, other ways of explaining why there appeared to be evidence against the null hypothesis. And I think Cohen actually apparently left out, or at least didn't give much emphasis to the most widespread misinterpretation, which I see all the time, is finding a large p-value as supporting or even proving the null hypothesis. I often people see interpretations that there is no difference or there is no effect, and citing a p-value larger than 0.05. He also notes that the goal set up in null hypothesis testing, which is to make an automatic decision, is not usually the goal that you really want. And he endorses a quote that seems to be advocating a subjective Bayesian approach, adjusting the degree of belief. And I'd say more generally, you could argue the purpose is to convey the evidence that's been uncovered about the competing hypotheses. Cohen spends quite a bit of time on what he calls the nil hypothesis, which is exactly a zero effect or zero difference or zero association. And he notes that it's never literally true, so it's kind of silly to ask or to test it. He has a good quote from John Tukey, a famous statistician, saying, "It is foolish to ask, are the effects of A and B different? They are always different for some decimal place." And so the supposed goal of null hypothesis testing doesn't actually make any sense. And he also notes that it's not even just the yes or no or even which direction, but also how big any difference or effect might be. And he notes that statistical significance is not the same as plain English significance. So he recommends a more flexible, informal approach, notes the exploratory data analysis approach of Tukey, emphasizing detective work rather than sanctification. I'd say really the key or a key idea for thinking about that might be that research doesn't need to be conclusive in order to be useful. He recommends focusing on magnitude of estimates and providing confidence intervals. And I think what he doesn't emphasize enough is that you've really got to focus the interpretation on them as well, on the estimates and the confidence intervals, not just on the p-values. I think nowadays we see confidence intervals given pretty regularly but then ignored in the interpretation stage. And his final recommendation is to rely on replication, which he only mentions really just with those words at the end of the abstract and the end of the paper. But I'd say one of the upshots of that is you can't expect every study to turn out to be accurate and shouldn't be interpreting them that way. And just to throw out a couple of possible discussion points for later, although I think we could certainly ignore these or focus on other things. One is, have things improved since 1994 when this came out, and if so, how have they improved? And to the extent that they haven't, what causes the persistence of the problems that have been noted with null hypothesis testing?